I have deliberately simplified this program, as it is the context and the relationship that counts, rather than the pure science or the pathways. The human body functions in a very narrow pH range, between 7.35 and 7.45. And should the pH move to 6.8 or 7.8, cell death will occur. And if your cells die, you're going to follow a short time afterwards. So it's important for the brain to constantly monitor the pH of the blood. And it does this through a little sensor in the brain stem, which is sensitive to pH change. And when the sensor sees that the pH is moving either side of the optimal 7.35 to 7.45, it has to do something to bring it back into balance. What it uses is a process that we call buffering. And buffering is nothing other than if something is acidic, you add an alkali, and if something is alkaline, you add an acid. And the alkali and the acid in the human body are bicarbonate and carbonic acid. And both of these substances require a constant pressure of carbon dioxide to be present in the body before they can be manufactured. So it stands to reason that if our carbon dioxide levels fluctuate, so will the amount of buffers fluctuate, and we might not be able to bring about the necessary balance as and when we require. So where do we get our carbon dioxide from? Many people believe that we get it in the atmosphere because that is where the thrust of global warming and climate change is, that the atmosphere is loaded with carbon dioxide. Down at ground level, that is not true, because CO2 is a plant food. And at ground level, we have less than 0.03% of carbon dioxide present. The human body requires 6.5% of carbon dioxide to be present at all times in order to successfully make the required buffers. This 6.5% is represented in scientific terms as millimeters pressure of mercury, which is nothing other than the pressure required to move the column of mercury up or down the glass tube in the old blood pressure monitor. 6.5% represents 40 millimeters mercury pressure, and we're going to be using that as the basis for this discussion. Well, if we don't have enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, where do we get it from? The answer is simple. We manufacture it ourselves. And it is a byproduct of exercise and metabolism, where the process of converting complex substances such as proteins, carbohydrates, sugars, into energy will release carbon dioxide and water as byproducts. At this point in time, I think it's important to talk about oxygen, because the human body's requirement for oxygen is only 5%, and the air around us contains 21%. So the reality is that as long as you are breathing, you have 4 times as much oxygen as you could ever require. So from the point of view of looking at the breathing mechanism at this stage, oxygen does not feature. We do not have to manufacture it. We do not have to store it. All we need to do is breathe. Once we've made the carbon dioxide, we have to store it. And we store it in the lungs. Basically, that is the prime function of the lungs, to interchange oxygen and carbon dioxide on a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week basis for the 50 trillion cells in the human body. Most people find this difficult to understand or to believe. But if we were to take a set of lungs and open them and iron them flat, they would occupy a surface area roughly equivalent to a tennis court. So to explain things a little more simply, why don't we regard the lungs for the moment as being like a little spa bath? And in a spa bath, you have a pump, you have a reservoir, you have an inlet, you have an outlet, and you have a reservoir level. Provided the water is above the inlet, the spa bath is going to work correctly. The lungs are very similar. The only difference being is that there's not water in the lungs. There's carbon dioxide, which has to be in the reservoir of the lungs. Should that fall below 35 millimeters pressure, that is when we start to experience imbalances which turn themselves into symptoms. Optimally, as we discussed, the lungs would like 40 millimeters pressure of carbon dioxide. And the brain is set to trigger breathing when carbon dioxide reaches that 40 millimeter mark. You will achieve and maintain that 40 millimeter level if you breathe functionally. And by functional breathing, we mean 8 to 10 breaths per minute at rest, in and out through the nose, not through the mouth, driven by the diaphragm, not by the upper chest, and most importantly of all, breathing should be silent. If you can hear somebody breathe, they are breathing dysfunctionally. Provided you breathe at that level, you will maintain your 40 millimeters pressure of CO2 in the lungs, and your system will function efficiently. If, however, you have developed habits like talking too fast, or sighing, or yawning, or sneezing, or coughing a lot, if you're in pain, where your breathing pattern changes as a pain management technique, you are not going to have 40 millimeters mercury carbon dioxide levels present in your lungs. And the brain will then adjust itself to whatever level you manage to create, which means that it will actually start to change its response position. And the breathing trigger position will move from the optimal 40 to 35 or 30 or 28 or 26 or whatever it is that you have set up as the body's new normal. On average, we breathe around 10 million breaths a year, which is around 28 to 30,000 breaths per day. If one or two of these breaths are out of balance, we don't have a problem. What happens if all 30,000 of these breaths are out of balance? That is when symptoms start occurring. Noses are made for breathing. The nose is a 4-stage filtration system. The hairs filter out the floaties in the air. There is an enzyme in the mucus that kills viruses and bacteria. The turbinates and the sinuses warm and condition the air, temperature control it, and humidify it before it goes over the final 2 filters, which are the adenoids and the tonsils, before entering the lungs. Lungs are extraordinarily sensitive. And you can imagine how the lungs respond if we bypass the nasal filtration system and breathe in directly through the mouth. In order to maintain the reservoir level within the lungs, we need to be able to control the rate and depth at which we breathe. And this is done using the diaphragm. And if we don't use the diaphragm as the primary muscle of breathing, we're going to have problems in maintaining the correct carbon dioxide pressure within the lungs. So let's become a little technical for the moment. What is in a can of soft drink? Most people's immediate response will be sugar, and they're quite right. A soft drink is water, salts, sugar, coloring, flavoring, and of course, carbon dioxide. That's why it's called a carbonated beverage. So it's a hot day, and you've been rushing around, and you pop a can of iced sparkling drink, and it's full of life, and full of sparkle, and full of fizz, and full of buzz. Have half the can. Come back an hour later. What's it like? It's lost its fizz, it's lost its life, it's lost its sparkle, and it's gone flat. So the question is, what is blood made of? Well, you might be surprised to know that blood is made of exactly the same things. Water, salts, sugars, coloring, and carbon dioxide. And as we've seen in the table above, carbon dioxide at the pressure of 40 millimeters mercury. The coloring in the blood, by the way, is the red protein called hemoglobin. So can you see now that if you lose the fizz out of your blood, you will lose the zest and the sparkle and the life and the bubble, and you will feel flat. So the question is, how do we lose fizz out of our blood? The answer is quite simple. We breathe through our mouths. We use our upper chest. We don't use the diaphragm correctly. And we become entrenched in a new breathing cycle which upsets our basic body chemistry. That is the cycle that causes the breathing trigger to move from its functional level at 40 millimeters to its dysfunctional level, which in most cases is round about the 30 millimeter mark, well below the 35 millimeters functional level. The question then is, why do we overbreathe? And I can give you the answer in one word, and that word is stress. There are many, many hundreds of different types of stressors, but we are able to break these stressors down into three main groups. The first group we call functional, and that covers how do you sit, how do you stand, what are your breathing mechanics and dynamics like, do you talk fast, are you in pain, do you spend a lot of your time hunched over the wheel of a car or over a computer screen. All of these physical things are stresses, and they change our breathing patterns. The second group of stressors are what we call ingestional. What do we put into, onto, and around our bodies, where if our bodies are not happy with what we have ingested, will do their utmost to reject them. This is stressful. Vomiting, diarrhea, coughing, sneezing, these are all stresses that we subject ourselves to if the body is trying to rid itself of inhospitable things. And the final group of stressors is not what we're eating, it's what's eating us. How do we cope with and how do we function in this, the 21st century? Do we react and very often cause problems? Or do we create solutions out of the circumstances that come our way? This is one of the major causes of stress in modern living. So how does the brain respond when it senses a constant and consistent shortage of carbon dioxide? These low levels of carbon dioxide prevent the brain from making the chemicals that we require to keep the pH in balance. There's a limit to how much CO2 can be made. What the brain can do is try to limit the amount that we release. And picture yourself in your garden, you're busy watering your plants, you have some new seedlings, you want to reduce the flow of water to the new seedlings. So all you need do is pinch the tube, constrict it a little, and the flow will reduce. That is what the brain does to our breathing tubes. It causes our breathing tubes to go into spasm, narrow the bore, and release the amount of carbon dioxide that we can exhale. And this is why people say, my chest is tight, or I'm having trouble breathing, or I can't catch my breath, or I'm breathless. All of these things are really valid. The mechanism is the brain trying to limit the amount of carbon dioxide that we lose. And unfortunately, many of these cases are misdiagnosed as asthma, where in fact it is not asthma, it is a bronchoconstriction brought about by dysfunctional breathing. If this was just restricted to our breathing tubes, we could probably cope without too much trouble. But where else do we have tubes in the body? In fact, everywhere. Nothing happens in the human body that does not go through a tube. So does it not stand to reason that if we're experiencing narrowing and spasming of the tubes in the breathing system, that this would not translate itself to high blood pressure, to digestive disorders, to nighttime toilet trips where the bladder goes into spasm and thinks it's fuller than it really is, to hormonal issues, reproductive issues. The list just goes on, because it is all a function of tubes working the way they were designed to work. If reducing the flow of carbon dioxide from the body is not sufficient or doesn't happen fast enough, the brain has another mechanism, and it causes us to hold our breath. And think for a moment whether there are times during your day when you find that you have stopped breathing. Many people, particularly when they're concentrating, find that they hold their breath. The reason for this is that if you stop breathing, your carbon dioxide levels will rise rapidly, providing the chemicals that the brain requires to keep your pH in balance. During the day, it's called a breath hold. At night, it's called an apnea. So we haven't paid too much attention to oxygen up until this point in time, and that is why we have this big open white space available. Oxygen obviously is critical to life. How is oxygen transported around the body? Let's simplify it and say it goes by train. It goes on what I call the hemoglobin express. So picture that in each lung you have a little locomotive, and behind the locomotive are millions of little carriages. Each carriage is a molecule of hemoglobin, the red protein, the coloring that we have in the blood. Inside each molecule of hemoglobin there are 4 little blobs of iron. And under the correct conditions, each one of those blobs of iron will bond a molecule of oxygen. So, provided the conditions are correct in the lung, and that means that there is an adequate supply of oxygen, that we have our 21% of oxygen passengers, all ticketed and ready to go, and provided that the pH in the lung is sitting at 7.45, the carriage doors will open. 4 passengers will enter. They will sit on their metal seats and lock down their chemical seat belts for the journey. And that will give us a saturated molecule of oxygen on the hemoglobin. There is no room for 5 passengers or 6 passengers. So breathing faster or deeper, or spending $20 at the local oxygen bar to put a tube up your nose, isn't going to make any difference at all. So we have this train with these oxygenated carriages traveling around the body, going to the various train stops. When the train gets to the position where the oxygen is to be released, somebody has to get inside the carriage, unclip the chemical seat belts, open the doors, announce to the passengers that this is the end of the line and they should please leave the train. Now, on a train, that is normally done by the conductor, and you can see how you spell the word conductor. Provided there are sufficient conductors at the various stations, the flow of oxygen will be unimpeded. But what happens if there is no conductor present? The result of that is carriage after carriage after carriage, loaded with oxygen, but not able to release that oxygen into the body for utilization. Restore the conductors to the train stations, and that means restoring carbon dioxide levels in the lungs to 35 millimeters or above, and you will release sufficient oxygen from the blood to have good quality sleep and awake refreshed. So the question is, if it was the combination of the lack of diaphragmatic breathing, of the upper chest breathing, of the mouth breathing, that caused our breathing patterns to change, do you think it's possible by reversing some of these, we can reverse the process and get the breathing trigger to go back to where it belongs? The answer, of course, is yes. And what we require to do here is to change the messages that we send to the brain. And instead of sending messages of low carbon dioxide, we want to send messages of high carbon dioxide. And we can do that quite successfully by changing our breathing pattern. And the more messages of high carbon dioxide that we send to the brain trigger, the more chance we have of getting it to return itself to its functional position. It also makes sense that we need to address the diaphragm breathing, the open mouth position, and the upper chest breathing. And provided we do these things simultaneously and have a look at the stressors that have caused us to adopt this dysfunctional pattern, we have a very good chance of restoring our breathing patterns to normal. I'm sure we've all seen people like this. Anxiety panic attacks, pale children with their mouths open, waking exhausted in the mornings, children with receding jaws, children with crooked teeth, people sitting on an airplane or on a bus or on a train with their mouths open, snoring away. All of these people have pretty ordinary tubes. The tubes are in and out of spasm, they're in and out of tension, and they suffer symptoms. They also have blood which is reluctant to release the oxygen, causing them lapses in memory, chronic tiredness, and the inability to function. I guess we've all seen people like this as well. People who exercise with their mouths closed, children with beautiful little gappy-toothed smiles, children who sleep with their mouths closed, comfortably and peacefully, and awake refreshed in the mornings. People with good posture. These people all have healthy, happy, open tubes, and blood that happily and rapidly releases the oxygen into the body. So it is essential for us to be able to measure carbon dioxide levels in the lungs. And for this we use a biofeedback capnometry technique, which is non-invasive, it is quick, it is simple, it is painless, it is low cost and highly efficient. Breathing is not all about oxygen. Breathing is predominantly about carbon dioxide, and that is the basis on which the Breathing Well program has been designed. So by now I'm sure that you can see how changing the software patterns that were created by the dysfunctional behavior can assist you in obtaining a more stable and long-lasting outcome as a consequence of the physical techniques and adjustment processes that you do as part of your existing practice.